So, ladies and gentlemen, the transition to the market economy also meant to privatize the economy because, well, the governments that in reality owned all the means of productions, factories, and so on and so forth, well, in a market economy, the governments are not supposed to be the producers of anything, right? So they had to be privatized, and that had another nasty impact, namely impact on employment, or rather unemployment. You know, in the communist world, unemployment did not exist. In other words, our people had a job. Well, it was lousy, didn't pay much, but it was a job. And all of a sudden, the Europeans, now in this part of the world, had to also adjust to the fact that there is such a thing as unemployment. So not only the prices went up, but many people were laid off. So that was a shock to the Europeans here, no? It must have been, and it was. Nevertheless, it did not cause conflict, it did not cause instability. But it created a side effect that was very unpleasant and also affecting daily life, namely corruption. If you privatize fast and wholesale, then of course it opened the countries to corruption. And the beginning of the transition to the market economy was not just the prices high, the unemployment, but also corruption. And that was the story for the 1990s. This is when the Europeans here in this part of the world for about a decade had to really endure, had to cope with the unpleasantness of the transition. But then they did it right, because in 2004 they joined the process of integration. So, ladies and gentlemen, they joined not only the European Union, but also NATO. And NATO is another organization in Europe that adds to the stability of it and to the democratic nature of all the changes. Let's start with the European Union. Now it is an area of more than 500 million people, 500 million people. It moved from 6 members, the original members, which were Germany, Italy, France, the big ones, 3, and the small ones, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, to 28. The latest edition is Croatia joining in 2013. And I was telling you about those stages, this process kind of unfolding, one part of Europe at the time, from 6 to 28. All the colored countries here are the countries that were joining. You see, it was 52 when it started, 73, 81, 86, 95, 2004, and then 2007 and 2013. And it's not the end of it, because Serbia, which also was a part of former Yugoslavia, now has the status of a candidate country. In other words, it is going through the to-do list, the Copenhagen criteria list, to make itself eligible for membership. And here are the benefits of peace and stability. Look at the size of the EU economy, and this is the sum of all the 28 economies put together. Why are they put together? Because for all practical purposes, they are one economy. There are no borders within the EU. Goods and services and people flow freely, no duties, no tariffs. They operate all the 28 economies under the common set of rules that is applicable to the whole area. So all for practical purposes, this is one economy, and look at its size. It is the biggest economy in the world. It's bigger than the US, and it's far, far bigger than the economy of China, India, Japan, or Russia. China, India, and Russia are the part of the BRIC countries, which are often said to be the future of the economic future of the world. Even if you add China, India, and Russia together, it is still far below the almost 13 trillion euros that is the size of the EU economy. And look at the wealth, GDP per person, per capita. Well, as soon as the Europeans stopped the conflicts, finished the wars, and, well, started to cooperate, look at the progress, and that is since 1945. Now, going by the GDP per capita, the Europeans have the third largest per capita income in the world, behind the US and behind Japan. While Japan started its changes more or less at the same time when the Europeans did, while the Americans started ahead of both the Japanese and the Europeans, and that's what really helped them, was actually the war, because it finished the depression of the 1930s. Well, look again, and China, India, or Russia. They are far, far below. What does that mean? Well, it means that, at least as the GDP is concerned, people simply have money. When they have money, they can buy goods, they can trade and do all the other things. This is the GDP per member state. What it is the GDP of the member states put together and divided by 28. And the number divided by 28 is the 100. It is the level to compare. So some of them, well, Luxembourg is really an exception. It's a tiny country, and that has to do with its financial sector. But all the other countries, no exception, ladies and gentlemen, when war came to an end, they all were poor, because they were, well, also destroyed, most of them. Now look at the progress, and now look at the number 80 and below. These are the countries, actually 83 and below. These are the countries that joined the EU in 2004, so more or less about a decade ago. For instance, Poland, now it's at 68. When it was joining, it was half of that, in the mid-30s. So within 10 years, the Poles doubled their GDP per capita. Well, again, if you give more time to all the countries that joined the EU in 2004, give them a few more years, and the numbers will probably go up even more. That is the benefit of stability, and that is the benefit of prosperity, and that is the benefit of democracy. Remember the three words? Stability, prosperity, and democracy. Here the three words are in numbers. And there is another set of numbers. Well, since the economies have been rebuilt, they started to produce things. Things are goods and services. The biggest share of the global exports, i.e. all the things that the EU sells outside of the EU, then the share of this global exports is 15%. Again, the biggest of them all. United States is close, Japan is way down, and China is almost on a par with the EU. Now look at the services, which is even more telling, and look at China. China exports is 14%, but services is only 6%. Well, why is that? Well, the services are usually more expensive to buy. You know, first you have to buy a plane, and then the maker of the plane have to maintain it. So the maintenance, because it's really labor, costs always more than the product itself, and it keeps on going and going and going. So the services and the goods are linked to each other. If Europe didn't have the 15% of share, it wouldn't have the 25% of share in services. That simply means this. This old new Europe produces a lot and sells it a lot to the world. That's, again, is a change, because, you know, not so long ago, Europe was giving the rest of the world wars and colonialists. Now, it just trades with the rest of the world and does it very, very successfully. And speaking of giving things to the world, well, except in addition to the wars, Europe also had the colonialists, and they weren't behaving nicely when they were going out there to do things, usually just to loot. Now, Europe is giving to the world 2/3, more or less, of development aid. What is development aid? It is money that the EU gives to countries, well, most of them are actually former colonies, to help them out with their own development. For instance, in Northern Africa, the Europeans have invested in orchards, growing oranges. That employs the local people, that gives them a way of making a living. They sell the oranges without tariffs back to Europe, so that helps the North Africans to have a better life. That's what development aid is about, and 2/3 of it, almost 60%, comes from Europe. So the big fat wallet that the Europeans have, they open it up and share some of the money in it, quite a bit, it's in billion euros, to other people who can use a bit of help and a bit of money.